Hey team, my name is Shelly, and your city is probably racist. Today, we're talking about exclusionary zoning. First, let's define what zoning is. Very basically put, zoning is a tool the government uses to determine what kinds of land uses can go where. It's what says that you can't build a coal plant next to an elementary school. If you've ever played SimCity, you know that there are three very basic types of zoning: industrial, commercial, residential. Exclusionary zoning is when this zoning tool gets used to keep certain socioeconomic classes out of residential neighborhoods. Let's dig into how that works. Around the turn of the 20th century, two big things were happening. First, a massive wave of urbanization. That means more people were living in cities than were living outside of cities. Second, there was a ton of immigration, and thus the xenophobic resistance to immigration that comes along with it. On top of all of that, our country was in the middle of Jim Crow laws and all of the painfully explicit anti-Black bias that came with those. With this dramatic increase in urbanization, policymakers decided it was time to make cities a little bit more organized, so they created zoning districts to determine what kinds of land uses could go where. This was the birth of zoning. And because this was Jim Crow America, using zoning to keep white residents segregated from Black and immigrant residents seemed like a pretty obvious action. The mayor of Baltimore in 1910 said that Black Baltimoreans, quote, should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority. Yikes. So cities started using zoning not only to separate land uses, but to separate white residents from Black residents. It wasn't until 1917 that this kind of explicit exclusionary zoning was deemed unconstitutional. But just like I mentioned in the last video, just because something is made illegal doesn't stop people from doing it. Over time, exclusionary zoning changed from explicit whites-only language to more subtle language, largely taking advantage of the fact that Black residents historically have been less likely to afford homes in single-family zoning districts than their white counterparts. In 1977, there was a Supreme Court case that challenged this more subtle type of exclusionary zoning. A nonprofit housing developer sued their city because, they argued, their city's building code was racially discriminatory. The developer wanted to build multi-family homes, so things like apartments, duplexes, townhouses, etc., in an area that was zoned for single-family homes, and the city said no. The developer argued in court that the building code, even though it didn't say anything about race, its impact was ultimately effective of racial discrimination because Black residents were less likely in that city to be able to afford single-family homes than white residents were. The Supreme Court sided with the city. And this is what exclusionary zoning looks like today. There are all kinds of zoning regulations that can push home costs up, ultimately driving low-income home seekers out of the housing market. Think about requirements for things like lot sizes, density maximums, setbacks. Ultimately, exclusionary zoning has the effect of reproducing racism in American cities by strengthening the likelihood that a white resident can live in a neighborhood that a Black resident can't afford to live in. This has all kinds of implications for things like access to good schools, economic opportunity, and even things like high-quality food. And this is an example of how cyclical segregation is. Your zip code is a profoundly strong indicator of your educational attainment and earning capacity. And if you're never able to earn enough money to move to a new neighborhood, you're stuck. My name is Shelly, and your city is probably racist.